Thank you so much. I saw smiles on every face as you concluded. So you succeeded. You succeeded in the room. Let me, if I may, make a couple of observations of my own. Open it for a few minutes of discussion. We'll have lunch, and then we'll come back for more interventions and more discussion. We've just heard very beautiful, very eloquent, very powerful messages from all of the major religious traditions here, and that's most of the world covered, about the oneness of humanity and the care for migrants. So this is both a proof of our concept of what brings us here, that there is a shared, deep, powerful, inspiring core of moral beliefs that permeate all of the major religious traditions. That was a very moving 2 hours that we've just heard. Very eloquent, and I think we've all become a little bit better linguists also because we heard about the linguistic roots of these ideas as well. So thank all of you for the wisdom that you've imparted. I want to make two quick observations. First, about the Abrahamic traditions, and then second, a general point and concern. If you think about what we heard about Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths, there is a notable ecological point. The Abrahamic traditions are all dryland ecological traditions. From the first movement of Abraham from Ur to Canaan, to all of the migrations that we've heard, to the exodus, or the migration, I should say, of first Joseph and then Jacob and the rest of the sons to Egypt in the midst of a famine, to Joseph's very good advice, by the way, store during the boom period so that you can consume during the lean period, which I always took to be the first good economic advice in the world. So I always regarded Joseph as the first economic advisor that we know of on intertemporal consumption smoothing. To the Exodus, to many migrations, including Jesus and the Holy Family, we see the ecological presence always of drylands, drought, the need to move, the collection of gleanings from the field left to the poor, because this is a very fragile region, the region of West Asia and the Middle East. It's very vulnerable. And I want to emphasize that it is extraordinarily vulnerable to climate change, to human-made climate change, because a region which is already on the ecological boundary of food safety, food security, by being a dryland region, is a region that is highly vulnerable to shifts in the climate. And when you look at the climate projections, both the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, the Gulf countries, and Western Asia are all directly in the line of fire of further drying, which is very dangerous. And we've already noted the Syrian drought, which was extreme during 2006 to 2010. But when my wife and I were in Tehran a few months ago, we were in the middle of sandstorms that were very serious because of sand being carried from Iraq to Iran because of the drying. There's pervasive disappearance of lakes, fresh water, marshlands, wetlands, all over the Middle East right now. And so this is both this is a very deep reality that you can see already the fragility from the Bible and the Quran, but it's about to get a lot worse. And all of the reasons for movement, which we know from the history of the traditions, are even more important now. The first lesson is we have to stop this human-made climate change. This is no joke. This is the challenge of our time. The second is we have to adapt to it, partly technologically, but also by calling on the core of the traditions. And the Abrahamic faiths have been dealing with drought, famine, movement, refugees for millennia. And that tradition is vital now. So this is the first point that I wanted to make. The second point I want to make is that the world is not living up to the faiths. In fact, quite the contrary. We're losing ground. This is a terrible period. Fortunately, Donald Trump has been blocked again and again by the U.S. courts in his nasty, mean-spirited, selfish approach. But that approach is widespread. Even when Trump was proposing peace last week, the peace was a Sunni peace against Iran. It was another deliberate attempt at divide and conquer. It's cruel, and it is dangerous. And so we really need to understand. Now, I have a particular view, a very dubious view of politicians. Politics can be a very glorious art. For Aristotle, who invented Western political science, politics was not about power, politics was about the common good. And when Aristotle asked the political questions, he examined the constitutions of the Greek city-states to ask which ones could serve the common good. That's politics in its high form. Politics in its low form is power. And power, I believe, is corrupting. And I think that the linkages are deep. They tap the dark side of human nature. And human nature, we heard all the best side in these presentations. We didn't hear too much about the dark side of human nature. There is a theory which I believe has a lot of merit, that the good side of human nature, the altruism, actually was born in part by strengthening in-groups to fight out-groups. So it was the result, ironically, altruism is a flip side of war in our human nature. That's what many evolutionary psychologists believe, that we are primed for good within our groups and we are primed for war between groups. And that's I think, a realistic view. It's not a fatalistic view, but it is, I think, a realistic view, which says that we are tempted to hate. Now, if that's the case, how does that hatred emerge? Sometimes it can be spontaneous from fear and group dynamics, but very often it is from demagogues and from those who seek power by spurring identity politics. Trump is certainly one of those. He came to power by saying to Americans that are hurting, your problem is Mexicans, Muslims, and Chinese currency manipulators. It was almost literally his line: Mexican rapists, Muslim terrorists, and Chinese currency manipulators. That's why you're hurting. Of course, it's all a deep lie, but you win power that way. And maybe he even believes it. We have no idea what he believes. Zero. And anyone who claims to know knows more than Donald Trump knows, I think. But the point I am making is that there's a lot of manipulation. And part of the problem is that religions are implicated in power. They're not separate from power. And I think, to my mind, this hurts religion very much, because religions are co-opted by the powerful. And every time there's an alliance of religion and the state, it's the religion that gets damaged, actually. It's not the state that gets damaged. It's the religion that gets damaged, because the religion gets corrupted by power, and it gets misused by power. And religion is most powerful when it's separate from the state, not because religious principles shouldn't be part of law, but because when they're together, the state really abuses religion, which is a thinking process, not a power process. It is a call to the best of the human side, not the manipulation of our worst side. So I think that we need to reflect in the afternoon that we have this very powerful message. We heard it last time in our second meeting, that don't blame religion for wars that are in the name of religion. And I think this is deeply true. I think it's profoundly correct. The wars are not wars of religion, but they're wars in the name of religion. And that is really a pernicious reality. And so speaking truth to power is part of it. Staying a little bit away from power, I think, is another part of it, that this is a separate sphere. When Metropolitan Zizoulas ended by saying, thank you for the remarks, not very practical, I think our purpose, I believe that the remarks everyone made are the most practical, the most important, the most about daily life. The politicians, in my view, live in a kind of fantasy world, a very destructive one. I don't think they're practical people most of the time. They're in their power games. But what you talked about was completely practical, about how to live daily life and what decency is. And so I want us to reflect on, in a world of power which we live in, how we make this message, which was shared message, the active carrier of practice, not the hate-filled one that we are experiencing everywhere. And I think it requires, it's tough, because it is tough, because powerful people have power, and they use it, and they're not nice. If you watch Donald Trump push the Montenegrin prime minister in the video, that is really psychologically what we're dealing with. We're dealing with brute force, and we need to find a way to overcome that. So those are my reflections from our discussion. Why don't we have 10 minutes of interventions, and then we'll go to lunch.
I have a question for Rabbi Jacobs. I found your presentation very moving and also very apt for something I have wondered for a long time regarding refugees, laws of return, and immigrants. When 9/11 happened, I was asked to be one of the heads in New York City for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of New York City and for Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management. One of the things that happened at that time was that we had to rapidly put together a model or models for how to dovetail so many agencies with Mayor Giuliani's office, and so that all these agencies could communicate with one another. There was a point where, early on, I would say within the first week, I was contacted by a rabbi in New York who wanted to organize a rotor of volunteer shomers. Shomers are persons in the Jewish tradition, and these shomers were volunteers who would come and do what is known as sitting shmirah, which is a type of sitting and guarding the body of someone who has died. And in addition to guarding the body, also guarding and accompanying the spirit after the death. It occurred to me that given that this was considered perhaps the greatest mitzvah, the greatest good deed that a person can do, which is to sit shmirah, because the person for whom you are doing the deed cannot return the deed in kind. They have died. They are not able to give back to the one giving to them. I wondered, in your opinion, if there might be parallels in someone wanting to assist in refugee and immigrant matters, wanting to guide and help on the journey out of a situation which is another kind of death into a situation of life. Perhaps there is some Jewish parallel for that or a model, but I recognized there were similarities, and I wondered what your opinion would be on that.
Thank you for the question and for the, frankly, maybe the inspiration and the idea. Obviously, to figure out how to bring one's presence to people who are struggling, it could be a person who's struggling with illness, is a part of all of our faith traditions. To accompany, to be present for, to give strength, to bring one's being and love to an individual and to a situation. So I think that the notion of shmirah, which of course we associate with a person who has died, but the notion of sometimes you have to show up, and it may be to be with people through difficult encounters with ICE, with immigration officials. It may be to help them negotiate the Byzantine world of our various governments and authorities. But I think the whole while it's to bring a spiritual presence of holiness and love and support and agency and protection and all those things that come with the practice of shmirah. So I love the idea, and I think that all of us in different ways would affirm and want to practice that, and to do so as an act of faith. The last point you made about it being a mitzvah shel amet, a righteous act of purity because there's no hope for reward. I hope that inspires all that we do. But these are acts that could both save and sustain people through the most difficult of times.
Very much. Marcelo.
Really was very nice to hear all these different traditions, religious traditions. But we can say that all these traditions, in some sense, are synthesized in the notion of natural law. For example, Thomas Aquinas say that the commandments, that is the law for the Jews, for the Muslims, for the Christians, are an expression of the natural law. Simple. The difference is that the commandments was revealed directly by God to Moses, but the content is exactly so of the natural law. So I think that we need to come back to this idea that there are something that is previous at the juridical rights. I think to go to our problem, to the refugees, we need to establish some criteria that could be, and some hierarchy of these criteria to avoid a conflict of interest. And I think this is we need to arrive this also with the consensus of the religions. But the more important thing that we can summarize about all these very interesting interpretations is that the religion is really open to the refugees. That is to say, it's a first idea that is that golden rule that we need to do to the others that think that we going to have for us. So this idea is not enough expressed in the different law, positive law that we have. And this is the idea that the Pope Francis tried to explain. This is not to say we don't have any control. No, the state have right to have control. But the papers not to give alimentation or to be some house and to give work. I think this is the question that we need to precise. Thank you.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you. Marcelo.
Thank you so much for the extraordinary, moving presentations. And like the Baroness, I was very moved by the Rabbi and by all the presentations of our colleagues. We're in the Pontifical Academies, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and I'm moved to suggest the extraordinary, powerful analogs that exist when we examine the anthropological record, when we examine the genetic record, and when we examine the development of the human brain. First, the data, while the minor details are constantly changing, the deep structure of our understanding of evolution are very clear. We are one species. We are an African species. The earliest human records originate in Ethiopia, in Omo Kibish, and they are dated, again, the measures change in the details, but the evidence suggests 200,000 years ago, the earliest forms of Homo sapiens sapiens are identified. Second, Yusuf said a very powerful truth. Homo sapiens sapiens is the child of Homo sapiens mobilis. Human movement made us what we are today. It is the migrations are in our neocortex. They are in our stereoscopic vision. They are in our bipedalism. Try 23andMe and you'll understand your origins in very different ways. The best evidence suggests that the human journey out of Africa begins probably between 70 and 60,000 years ago, probably rooted in some catastrophic climatic change that brought us near to extinction. It is, in fact, with the beginning of the movement out of Africa that we begin to see these transformational changes. So this is the first point. The scientific record tells us of a journey away from a prior state of wellness that is lost. And the human journey is a journey to reclaim that space in our shared planet. Second point, the child emerges as a person in the gaze of the mother. The brain data on this are overwhelming. The so-called mirroring neurons. In other words, we come into being in the act of the gaze. I think our colleague William made this point, of the other. The labyrinth of solitude, to quote the great Mexican writer, in individualism is an anomaly. The human person emerges in relationship with, first, with the gaze of the mother. The great British psychoanalyst, Donald Winnicott, talks about the mirroring the mother serves to the child. And this, of course, takes us to a point that Monsignor Marcelo has made, which is a point echoing the teachings of Paul Ricoeur, which is the fundamentals of humanism is recognizing myself in another, which closes what begins with the gaze of the mother and the beginning of the journey of the emergence of the person as a spiritual, as a being, not a biological being. So three somewhat inchoate points that I think show an exquisite alignment with the fundamental teachings we've heard from all of the world's religions. Science and religion have a deep structure that tells a very, very powerful story about how we came to be what we are.
Thank you very much. I think we've arrived at lunch, and well earned, with, again, fantastic participation and interventions by all. Yeah. So we will reconvene at what time? 3 o'clock. And let me give a couple of points of guidance. I don't know whether a sheet called To Whom Much Is Given has been distributed. Yes, okay. This is based on our discussion yesterday about convening high net worth individuals. So this is a specific proposal for us to make, hopefully to Pope Francis, to interest him in this idea of convening such a meeting. I put in some numbers of the trillions involved and what they could mean. So please have a look at this. And then there will be another statement, which is a draft of a summary for our 2 days of discussion. We'll distribute that now. We'll print it out and distribute it at lunch. And so when you come back, be prepared to share ideas on both of these documents. And we continue with the afternoon program.